Okay. Hello and welcome everyone to Biotensegrity Tea Party number 9. Today we feature Scarr's Adhesions and the Biotensegral body. I'm your co-host, Chris Clancy. I'm from Vancouver, BC in Canada. And I'm here with fellow co-host Susan Lowell de Soloranzo, who's in Washington, DC. Hi, Susan.
Hey, everybody.
And co-host Graham Scarr, who joins us from Nottingham in the UK. Hey, Graham. Hi.
Hello. Hi, Chris.
Good to see you. And today we are also pleased to be joined by guest host John Sharkey, who's from Dublin, Ireland. Hey, John. Thanks for being here. We're so glad to have you.
It's like the Eurovision Song Contest. Come in, Dublin.
There's so many of us. And
2 points.
so we are also grateful to have with us the editor and key authors of the book, Jan. Hi, Jan.
Hi.
Jan Trewartha and Sharon Wheeler, who's from Seattle. Hi, Sharon. I've got so many people up here on my screen that I can't see you. Also, in addition to John and Graham, we have other contributors. Joanne Avison, who is, I think, from Brighton. Joanne, are you from Brighton?
I'm originally from London, but I'm calling from Brighton.
You're calling from Brighton. Okay. Leonid, is Leonid Blyum here?
He was. Maybe he's not back yet.
Anastasia is nodding, so he will be here at some point. Anastasia, oh, there he is. Hi, Leonid. You're tucked away in the corner. And Leonid is from, calling from Marbella. How do I pronounce
I guess
that?
so. Marbella, Spain, yes.
Marbella, Spain. Welcome.
Quarantine
Leonid.
veteran, you know, over here. Yes, thank you.
And normally residing in?
Limassol, Cyprus, and elsewhere.
Cyprus, okay. So we have got a great program today. So many guests. And we're very pleased that you are all joining us as well. Right now, we've got 52 here on Zoom. I haven't been able to check the YouTube live yet. We'll do that afterwards. First of all, before we begin though, Susan, can you tell us about today's sponsors?
Yes. So thank you. Our Biotensegral Tea Party is a production of the Stephen M. Levin Biotensegrity Archive and made possible in part through support from Handspring Publishing in East Lothian, Scotland, producers of highly accessible, easily applied, research-based material for movement and manual therapy professionals. The amazing team at Handspring, they really are wonderful. They see publishing as an art as well as a science, and for them it's really a human and intellectual enterprise as well as a business. So if you get a chance to work with him, you're a lucky ducky. We're also generously supported by Chris's educational organization, Embodied Biotensegrity in Vancouver. And for those of you looking to learn more about biotensegrity, Chris's programs are really an excellent resource. Right now, she's running a 28-day free trial. So, and a pay-as-you-can course in biotensegrity called Shifting Paradigms that's really been a lot of fun to be in. Yes, I am taking a course in biotensegrity. It's wonderful. The Biotensegral Tea Party is also sponsored by Artifact Pro of Madrid, where you can find beautiful, wonderfully constructed tensegrity models of the spine and pelvis, and other really amazing treats. Check out last week's Biotensegral Tea Party number 8, and you'll see Fernando Tejero doing wonderful demonstrations. John's showing off his right there. Look at that. Thank you, John.
Okay, thank you, Susan. And before we start, I just want to again welcome John Sharkey. John is a biotensegrity pioneer. He has been going to the big, been a member of the big family since the beginning, almost the beginning, and he's a true trailblazer. John is the one that is flying around the world until recently to Australia, to Canada, Europe, all over the place, bringing biotensegrity to different groups. He's been to Pilates and conferences. He teaches osteopaths, manual therapists, and he runs an amazing dissection, the first ever and the only ever Biotensegrity informed dissections in Dundee. This year, I understand you're doing something also in the US, as well as there's too many things to name. I'm gonna actually, I'll put maybe a link up to your bio somewhere, John, because what I would really love to do is to invite you to start us off with our tea party cheers, and then we'll get to the panel.
Well, thank you, Chris. And what I'd like to do in terms of a toast, being the month of May, I think it's poignant that the production of this book, Scarr's Adhesions and the Biotensegral Body, with the tagline, which I think is also important, science, assessment and treatment. And we might get into that a little later on. I'd like to dedicate this particular Biotensegral Tea Party to our friend and colleague, Willem Fray, who passed away this month last year. And for anybody who knew Willem, he was a physiotherapist based out of South Africa. And of course, Willem had written on many occasions for the Journal of Bodywork and Movement Therapy. And he was also involved in the Fascia Research Society and the International Fascia Research Congress, presenting on scars. And myself and Willem had actually been planning a scar therapy program that we were going to deliver jointly. And unfortunately, Willem had a tragic accident on his bicycle while out cycling. He loved to cycle. So just to start us off, and in memory of Willem, and to say to Trudy and his family, we truly miss him, and we're thinking about him. He is not forgotten. So to Willem.
To Willem.
To Willem.
To Willem.
Willem Fray, South Africa. You can check him out and check out his work. So you're very welcome. I suppose at this stage I get to ask questions. Is that right, Chris?
Yes, you can.
Brilliant.
You've introduced the book a little bit, and the panel is up to you to head up, and I know you're going to bring out some interesting discussion. So take it away, John.
Well, the odd thing is there was one question. I'd written down some questions because I had the entire book sent to me. I thought that was important, that I would go through the entire book and have a sense of the book in order to be able to ask poignant questions. And it's great to have Jan, and it's great to have Sharon with us today. Jan has just come off the back of the British Fascia Symposium, which was a huge success. Well done. And during my sessions, there were questions and answers, and Dr. Davis was there as well, and she stole one of my questions. So I get to that a little later on. I was thinking, haha, you've been paying attention too. Because when people use certain terms or phrases, I think it's important that we understand what exactly the person means by that. So I suppose I'm going to start, first of all, by saying the book is an excellent book, by the way. I mean, I really, really enjoyed it. And I think it's a fantastic tome. But, and I might address this to Jan initially, and then Sharon may wish to offer something into this as well. But so we have Scarr's Adhesions in the Biotensegral Body. So I suppose my first question is, why did you feel that there was a necessity for a book on scars? And secondly, you know, where did your interest in the biotensegral body, why did you couple that in with the topic of scar therapy? Where did that come from?
Okay.
Before you answer, I'm going to jump in because a lot of people are confused about that this is actually the name of the book and which are the authors. So can you give us that rundown, John? I'm sorry to interrupt.
Not at all. So Jan Trewartha is one of the editors, and the other editor is Sharon Wheeler. And the name of their book is Scarr's Adhesions in the Biotensegral Body, with the tagline, which I love, Science, Assessment and Treatment. So that's the book. It's out now, and it really is an amazing book. And I think Jan knows me, that I shoot from the hip, that if I didn't think it was a good book, I'd actually avoid saying almost anything. It's a brilliant, brilliant book. I really enjoyed reading it. particularly the chapter by that anatomist guy. Wow, boy, was he, boy, was he.
That Sharkey chap.
No, but it really is. It's an absolute joy to read. Very easy to digest. I mean, the writing style, the way you edit it is a credit to you both. So, I mean, if I can understand it and read it, then I think it's open to anybody. So, Jan, do I need to repeat the question, or are you comfortable enough with?
No, not at all. Yes, I was just trying to think back, really, because this month, I mean, it seriously is 3 years to the month since the first concept of the book. And that came after a chat with Joanne Avison, which I'll go into. But before that, probably for, I don't know, maybe a year, I'd been thinking I need to write about scars. I've got to write about scars. And I've been a therapist for 28 years or so now. And so I've been around the block, and I've done a lot of work on bodies and really freeing up fascial restrictions in the body. And that's been my work for years. And I found that there were some people who would come back and back and back. And the kind of work I do, which is facilitated positional release, really, after you've sort of rebalanced them and got them all moving again, you shouldn't really have to revisit that unless they're doing something in their life which is damaging them, creating repetitive strain injuries and body patterning. So I was amazed, really, because I hadn't really thought about the scars. And I went to the Fascia Research Congress in 2012 in Vancouver, which is where I met some of you guys. And where I met Sharon Wheeler, because I have a scar. I was looking for some help, and somebody said, oh, well, there's this woman, and she's like the guru in North America and Canada for scars. It's fantastic. How do I find her? And she's over there. She's sitting in the corridor with her lunch quietly. So I sort of land on this woman going, can you help me, please? And she goes, sorry, Sharon, this is what I was saying. Yeah, I guess. My accent's terrible. She just looked at me as this sort of person jumping on her in the corridor. So, really desperate at the time for help. And she worked on me. And I was so blown away by this and the difference it made in my body. So I thought, this is interesting. So I went back and I trained with Sharon. And then I came back to England. I was the only person who did Sharon Wheeler's scar work in the whole of the UK. So I was pretty unsupported, but I got on with it and I practiced. And I found that I was then working, if I worked on the scars, then the rest would free up. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. And I started to think about scars and think about their three-dimensionality and how the effects of them cascaded through the tissues. And as I got better at it and more understanding, it became more and more obvious. And I was getting such good results. And I thought, this is amazing. So, and we got Sharon over for the first ever workshop, which was after the 2014 British Fascia Symposium, which we had down here near Windsor. And we've managed to start training some people. And we were getting good results. And I thought, I was getting really into this and really starting to understand scars a whole lot better. And when I look back, I don't think I understood much at all, but I understand much more now. And when I just look back in 5 years, I'll probably think, I thought I knew so much. Because I find it it's something that keeps unraveling and unwinding and you're seeing more and more all the time. And so I was chatting to Jo Avison one day, wasn't I, Jo? And I was saying, I want to write a book on scars, but I just can't think it's got to be for therapists. I want therapists to wake up to this, to understand how important they are and how it's impossible to free up restrictions when you've got a scar in the way. And Jo said, because I was part of the Biotensegral interest group, because Biotensegrity interest group, because I discovered Biotensegrity and I was very involved in learning more, but I wouldn't say I knew much at all. I still don't consider myself to be somebody of an expert or anything like that. So I was on the edge of it all, but fascinated by it. And Jo said, well, why don't you do it within the Biotensegrity concept? And I thought, oh, yes, okay. And then afterwards, I thought, well, I'm not going to do that because I don't know enough about Biotensegrity, obvious. And then after, it sort of processed slowly as these things do. And eventually I thought, Well, of course, I do know people who are experts. And it just went, probably for about 6 months. And then I approached Joe, approached John, Leonid, Graham. I said, would you be interested? Would you support me in this? Obviously talking to Sharon, who's my teacher as well. And everybody said, yeah, we'd be interested in this. So I put a proposal into Handspring Publishing and they accepted it. So there we go. And that's how it all started. But it has been a labor of love for all of us for 3 years, pulling this together. But I think the result gives us so many different viewpoints, from you, John, as a dissector, from Joanne as a movement expert, from Leonid looking into the implausibility of light touch, to Graham with his modeling expertise, and then Sharon with her own approach and all her background and her history of being somebody who trained with Dr. Ida Rolf directly. Was it 40? It must be 45 years ago now, I think, Sharon, because I think it was 40 years when we met. And then my own input as a therapist. I think it comes in and it's gathered so much information and so many viewpoints together. And I think taking it from those different viewpoints helps people to understand biotensegrity from different way. It gives you different angles into it. And I think it gives a more complete view of how biotensegrity, looking at biotensegrity informs your view of what scars do to the body. Is that what you wanted?
Excellent. And Sharon, do you have something to add to that? And in particular, so the question, of course, was why you felt this book was needed now, but also perhaps maybe you could talk a little bit about, and I'm asking the question because of your background within SI, structural integration, and it really is a great legacy that you had the opportunity to meet and listen to Ida Rolf. I'm sure there were aspects to her work that you agreed with. Maybe as you go through your own journey, maybe there's things that you would change or whatever. But so yeah, did SI inform you? And if so, how did it inform you? And a little bit about your journey.
Well, structural integration does help to see the body as a whole. And Dr. Rolf very early on was explaining about tensegrity in my classes in 1970. So we've been aware of the idea for a long time. And what I found was that scars limit the range of motion, the play of the tensegrity in the body. They limit it. And people can't move and they can't breathe and they can't do things as well as they would like. And if you can get the scar to release and to, well, in a sense, disintegrate and turn back into normal fascia, in a sense is what I think I'm doing. If you can do that and it disappears for all intents and purposes, then the functions return, which is very interesting. So, and unexpected, really. So, and the whole work is rather unexpected. I can't say that structural integration informed me how to work with scars. It really didn't. Dr. Rolf didn't have anything special for them. She said, ignore the scar and establish the function. But when the scar is extreme, that doesn't work. So I thought I would soften it up a little bit, and it really worked. I was surprised. So, I've been developing it for a long time. So I just look at what works and take that, rather than try to guess why it's working or how it's working. It's a practical thing.
And why so do you feel that now is the right time for a book like this? I mean, I can't really think of another book quite like it, to be quite honest with you. I was trying to think about that. I know there are some other texts out there, but I think it's arrived at a very poignant time, and it is something that people perhaps either don't consider or perhaps they avoid.
Well, I don't think people realize that you can change them very much. And certainly even in the fascial world, it's thought by some people that you can't change the consistency and makeup and of a scar after 10 days. Right. So, yeah, so this work takes a scar of any age and changes it. So that kind of it makes a little bit of a difference there. So I think that it's a good thing to put into the whole idea on fascia, that you can do something with this material. And scars are very tough. I mean, you do the dissection, and they're so tough that they dull scalpels. And when people go in, you have plates and pins put in on breaks and stuff, and people sometimes take them out. Well, when the doctors go in to take it out, they dread dealing with the scar tissue because it obscures anything that's important. It makes the job very much longer, and it's very difficult to cut through. So if you can get rid of that scar tissue, it makes it a breeze for them.
And your clinical experience demonstrates, over quite a lengthy career now, both yourself and Jan,
Yeah.
that this type of intervention, in fact, works. And what's really interesting, because this also is coming out now in some of the research papers because of for example, the discovery of Piezo 1 and 2. James Oshman was talking about, he wrote a book on energy medicine many years back, and he was talking about the effectiveness of light touch. And as often is the case, sometimes people might say, well, where's your evidence? And sometimes it takes some time for science and for research to catch up with a good hypothesis. And that's another thing, by the way, that people should be allowed to have a hypothesis or should be allowed to express an opinion that's based upon what they're seeing in clinical practice. And he and others always espoused light touch. So what is it about light touch, do you think, that is so effective in the treatment of scars?
Well, it's light touch, and I am not pushing to get very much change every time I put a pressure into the tissue. And one of the things that structural integration gave me, which is the same in the scar tissue work, is the directional vector of the touch is head on into the directional vectors you'll find in the tissue. And scars set up vectors of pull. So if you go head on directly into the worst of it, what happens is a little tiny bit lets go. I think people haven't found this approach because you have to do many repetitions to get a lot of change. 3 to 5 repetitions, you won't see much, but 30 to 50, you'll see a lot of change. So I think it just takes a lot of patience to do it. And once you find out that that's true, you can just apply these different vectors. And the techniques are ways of delivering pressure into the system. So it seems to kind of melt away the adhesion between the structures that are there.
And with all due respect to younger people who are coming into the touch therapies, my own experience is that oftentimes people feel that they need to be seen to be doing something, because somebody has paid them £70 or $70. And there can often be this gung-ho, high energy. And I think it's that as you go through your journey in the touch therapies and you have your experiences, it's when you probably get a little bit more mature, you realize that less is more. Jan, if you would comment on less is more. And also I want you to, if you could, I loved that term and I wanted to just hear a little bit more about it. And Dr. Davis, as I say, again, because of her wisdom, it's just a real reflection of her experience. She picked up on this phrase, just as I did, which the tissues go home.
Yeah.
So could you expand on that a little bit as to what exactly does that mean? And it's a consequence of what? Why do tissues go home and how do they go home?
Well, I suppose I'm not a scientist and I don't know why they go home. I guess it is just my experience in all these years that when you start to work with the body, when you facilitate it in the correct way, when you don't impose your own expectations on the tissue, then, and you just facilitate it, and we do this with light touch, and Leonid probably is the best person to explain how light touch works. But when you just facilitate it, hold it, wait for it to move, it starts to move. And you can impose different expectations on it, maybe some kind of protocol of treatment or movement. But I suppose my own personal contention is, and it's in my own opinion, is that if the tissue is holding, if the soft tissue is holding, or any tissue in the body, right down to the bone, is holding a pattern of injury, trauma, RSI, whatever, that has been maybe there for years, decades, or just even a few weeks, it doesn't matter, then that needs to be replayed by the body. And this is my opinion, everybody, okay? This is my opinion, my empirical experience, that it needs to be replayed by the body. And so you hold the tissue, you hold it, you engage with it, and you wait. And you will see that it moves. You will see it, you will feel it unwinding. Basically, I think this is fascial unwinding, as Paolo Tozzi explained in Fascial Dysfunction, the book edited by Leon Chater a few years ago. You will feel it unwind. And then when it's unwound, it will simply move back to where it belongs. And when that happens, there's a settling in. When we all know that feeling, that settling in. And I have found over the years that this provides a more long-term result for in-body treatment, in physical treatment, personally. And I think that's what's happening with the scars, you know. And when I'm working on the scars, again, quite often I'm using one of our techniques, the scar work techniques, and I'm working and just following I start following the tissue. I'm doing the technique, but the tissue will start to move. And I just stay with it and I wait for it to replay. And sometimes it moves circularly. Say in a linear scar, you can almost feel where the sutures have gone in and come out again, gone in and come out again, gone in and come out again. And I'm holding the two edges of the scar and it's rotating. And you can feel that patterning and also the tugging and the pulling, because it's not easy to suture, you know, it's in, out, in, out. You know, I was a nurse and maybe things have improved these days, but as far as I could see, it was a, you know, there is a pull. And even on YouTube, if you're watching surgery, you can see it's in, out. You know, there is a pull and a tug on the tissues with the best will in the world. Maybe not on so much on, you know, facial work. What am I talking about? Beauty work, you know. Facelifts and things, obviously, but on those big old scars, then they're sewing up, there is a tug in the tissues, and when you're working on it, you can almost feel that, and the tissue is replaying. And sometimes it'll go, your hands will almost vanish as one hand sort of goes under the other. I've put pictures in the book of it, and your finger vanishes into the tissue. They're weird patterns, and that is because you're following the tissue. You're not making that up, you're following it. And when it's released it's almost like the body breathes, you know, that still moment. And then it goes back and it's connected in a more three-dimensional way. You can feel that with experience. So yeah, I follow the tissue and tissue goes home. That's my mantra.
Lovely. I mean, I arrived in the USA in 1979, starting my first degree. And you know, because of my interest in body work, I, you know, sought out structural integrators and others because I always wanted to experience. In other words, I never like commenting on anybody unless I've actually experienced what the therapy is like. And certainly in those days, I loved the work of Ida Rolf, but when I got on the table, just my own experience, when I got on the table, what I was experiencing didn't seem to match up with what I had been reading. It's interesting to hear Sharon say that, you know, her comments in relation to the scars and in relation to SI. So that to me is it's worthwhile maybe just investigating that a little bit with Sharon, that you would have come from that. I think there was quite a lot of, you know, this, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that was my experience of it over the years. I think it's changed, but you've come, you know, to come from that to suddenly come to light touch. And I think you've vocalized it really well, Jan. Picking up on some of the points you made about, in many ways, not forcing your agenda on the tissues. And I wonder, would Sharon speak a little bit about to that? In other words, that if you go in gung ho, perhaps you're not listening in the way that you should, where maybe a softer, slower approach allows you to listen. Does that make sense?
Yes, and indeed, you know, one of the general things we tell our students is that when you get into a situation and the tissue feels very tight, go lighter. Don't go heavier, go lighter. Back off on things, take it easy. Nothing that we're doing in our work is urgent. if you know what I mean. This is after the person has had a dreadful trauma and survived and maybe been helped by the surgery people and medicine to survive. We are cleaning up after both the damage and the interventions. And you never know what you're going to find. So I don't try to think ahead. I start on the surface, I resolve the surface to the next level, and whatever it is comes up, and I work with that, and I work with the next and the next and the next. And I just keep going head on into the most tension, which is why, in a way, the tensegrity model is so apt for fitting in with scars, because we're just playing with tension. And the idea is to get it so that the tension is distributed and smooth throughout the whole system, so that you can, excuse me, so that you can't feel any irregularities in the tissue. So we restructure the scar to feel like the normal tissue around. And as I say, the interesting thing is that when you do that, you get all sorts of functions returning that I would never have guessed would have done. You get nerves returning. Within the work, the time of the session, you get the nerve to return to often full function, which is very strange. If you asked me to do it, I'd tell you I couldn't. I have no idea. And all sorts of other things happen. Internal organs start to function and move the way they should. Because how can the internal organ function and do its motility, as Baral talks about, when it's tethered to a scar? So if you can get rid of the scar and turn the scar back into smooth, regular tissue that's adaptable, like the fascia that you see in Gimberto's films that's so beautiful. When you see that, and it feels like that, then all these functions seem to be there. It's very strange.
It's so fascinating too. And John, I've heard a lot of talk about light touch. I'm wondering if it's if we could get maybe one of the other panelists. I hear that Leonid has a whole chapter focused on light touch. Do you have any questions lined up for him, or?
Yeah, I wasn't quite sure if the different contributors wished to jump in at some stage or put their hand up to say, well, I've got something to contribute in that regard. That might be a nice way, and maybe this might be a nice lead in, just to, if Leonid had some specific comments in relation to light touch. I'm going to just set up one comment if I can, and this is why I found the book so powerful as well when I was reading it, is that we want to try to provide a safe space for people. And scars come in a multitude of different shapes and personalities, and so there is an emotional aspect to them as well. And I'm not a psychotherapist or a psychoanalyst, and I'm just wondering, we could maybe speak about that in just a couple of moments' time, because I think by placing somebody in a safe place, they recognize that there's empathy coming from the practitioner, nothing but care. There's no ill will or bad agenda. And so this really, I believe, sets the body up for healing. I really believe that. But perhaps, Leonid, in terms of just the appropriate level of touch and palpation, could you comment to that?
I'm happily do. So actually, first of all, I must appreciate the detail of the expression that came both from Sharon and from Jen. And really, you see, in these 2 months of a quarantine, I was kind of really focused on the mathematics of the connective tissue, shall I speak about it, right? So you see that this is one of the biggest points, because as I'm listening to you and with Sharon really bringing the point of the like a little bit at a time, not being expecting much at once, and the cumulative results and so on. And then I also really love those specific descriptions from Jan, when it's a description of a tug, one can really see like that you are, as a person, you're really sort of connecting to it. You are sort of reliving the actual tug, right? And the tug, as I'm opening the dictionary, right? So it talks about the sudden pull, right? So, and what is a sudden pull? sudden pull, if you talk about the position, right? So you see then the first derivative is velocity, the second derivative is acceleration, then the third is the jerk, right? So there is even a consideration for the tug being the fourth derivative, right? So it's a change within a change within a change. So how well does the connective tissue capable of doing it? And it's an important thing, which we, if we get back to my chapter, which is the unreasonable effectiveness of the light touch. So speaking of the things that you're dealing with, right? So you're going like into the depth, which would be like fourth derivative, right? So whilst all the measurements, they actually end at the second. So, and this is one of the important things when we talk about quantification and how, like, is it possible to verify this work, or what is the explanation? And because indeed, this is the first starting point, right? So that the scar dulls the scalpel. And if we talk about, like, especially if we are in the cerebral palsy world, right? So you see, it would be, the nearest parallel to the scar will be a contracture. And the surgeon says, guys, what do you expect? How can you possibly tell a person or expect any change in the contracture when I'm actually like dulling the scalpel when trying to cut through it? So this is really one of the biggest questions, right? So how can you get this change via apparently such a huge mismatch in forces? And that's really the essence of my chapter, so that what you are all doing very well, that you are describing the process, you are like really, one can see super empathy and connection at the really like kinesthetic level. But the problem is that once we start using these languages, they're not precise, right? So, and what one person feels by the tug versus the other person, and then go with the tissue, it's a hodgepodge of terms, right? So you kind of use the term vector, then the term feel it, and so on. So what I was just trying to do there is to kind of bring first the consideration that, yes, we have to realize that for everyone outside our like touch community, when we talk about release of something which is as stiff as a scar via the light touch work, there is no plausible explanation in the standard physics, right? So, and that has to be understood. So, but that shouldn't discourage you or disqualify by any means what John was saying about having the reasonable hypothesis, right? So you see, which can start from practice first. And what I was trying to actually explain in this thing is that if we start looking at the new sciences which have emerged in the last 15, 20 years, we are going to find plenty of elegant explanations. And one of the things that I brought there was actually the adaptation of the new field, which is called peridynamics. And peridynamics studies the elastic forces at distance. And in peridynamics, we actually find a beautiful set of explanations which points out the idea of the metastable state. I mean, it sounds maybe a little bit like over the head, but metastable is actually quite easy to understand, right? So that means that the system has a stability point, the energy minimum point, which is lower, but it's being stuck behind the barrier, right? So, and once we move from the explanations of the release to the explanation of the metastable conditions, which could be reset to the lower point, to the more energy efficient point by external uniform deformation, and everything that you've been describing with your light touch, empathy, like all these things is actually about building the face there. So that was my point, that actually, once we start converting the common language and those beautiful experiences in a more formal language of mathematics, we can actually find both the inspiration for the improvement of the techniques and at the same time the new level of explanations of the effects.
And yeah, and I was going to ask Joanne. Joanne has her hand up as well. Joanne, what comment did you want to make before him?
I was just saying yes to Leonid. That was so beautifully said.
Well, I practiced, thank you.
And I'd love to add at this moment how Jan, thank you for what you said at the beginning, but I remember we met in the lab over a cadaver in
Yes.
Dundee dissection in the first Biotensegry soft fix dissection. And the beauty of working with that soft fix was that we actually got to see how tension and compression mutually organize as best you can in a non-fix, the whole beauty of the soft fix cadaveric specimen. And I personally feel this has made the most massive contribution to the understanding of biotensegrity in the facility. I remember being there with you at the table, Jan, the first year that we did it. And we discovered and saw the impact of what looked like, and this is a key thing, what looked like on the outside, the most beautiful suture. It was the finest line you could imagine. And it was the sort of thing where people come to me in my SI practice and say, oh, I had a fabulous surgeon. There's hardly any scarring at all. I've got the most beautiful suture. And of course, I know from experience that it doesn't look like that underneath. It's a very different story. And I came to SI as a yoga teacher. So movement was my thing. And at the simplest level, what you saw there was how, if you imagine a sweater, let's say, that's joined at the top and the bottom and you're inside it, your tension compression body, you know, where does it end? It doesn't. And you imagine tying a great big knot in that, which is the scar effectively, and you then start imagining that person trying to move, where that adhesion has not just prevented glide, but it's completely reorganized. It's initiated the reorganization of an entire pattern, and that's a pattern interrupt. Now, I'm not saying it's good, bad, or indifferent, but all I am saying is what we were able to see that day was how that pattern interrupt did several things. It had almost generated its own system within the body. It was huge. The scar was like a pencil line, and underneath it was like a thick scrubbing brush that was 1 inch deep, if I remember, and about 2 inches by 1 inch for a little strip. But then it tethered itself to the spine through the organs. And what you found yourself doing, and this is obviously purely anecdotal, but was imagining that that person trying to get up and reach for something, it would almost be as if their jumper had got caught in their trousers and they couldn't reach the thing. Now, they might have a problem anywhere else in the body that wasn't directly related to the scar in their mind, the treatment of which, I won't use the word release, the treatment of which would transform their motion. The other point I want to endorse is also that as a yoga teacher in restorative yoga, I was trained not to do the power yoga so much. I was trained in that, but the very subtle restorative yoga, where we do something we call giving the body back to itself, inviting the client rather than to surge through their limitations and reach beyond their limits and extend their range and stretch, dare I say. We encourage them to come back, and I think another version of bringing themselves home, so they move toward limitation as a kind of a grace and then manage to work with it. So in answer to people in the chat box like Harry, for example, who's a yoga teacher, who said, does this apply in movement? Absolutely. It's different amplifications, different frequencies, but scar tissue changes frequency. And I think that is where we're entering the realm of opening the scope of how we treat ourselves, our bodies in movement, in manual therapy, on a much more subtle range of understanding the difference we make with very, very light intervention.
Yeah, really nice. I mean, the idea of gung-ho, get in and break. So, I mean, you were, Joanne, you were a little slow there, or hesitant, or perhaps you were almost wanting to avoid the word release, because lots of people ask me that question. How do you release, you know, really what is equivalent? It's meat. How do you human meat? How do you release meat? And the truth is you can actually depend on, I always talk about superficial to deep, but in the body, aspects of scars will also include the fact that, for instance, I just use this piece of paper and I've kind of made it into an accordion, and tissues can elongate in this way but you could get some parts of it that have been, you know, adhered, and now they're stuck and they're dampened. And sometimes just a gentle suggestion, I was going to say this to Sharon or to Jan, whoever wants to take it up, but sometimes it's that gentle suggestion, whether it's 2 fingers or it's a larger movement, but it's a suggestion to the body. It's almost like a biofeedback, and the body will either accept that and say, well, first of all, it says, oh, hang on a second, what's going on here? That's the fight or flight. Should I be concerned about this? Or if not, the body has that inner wisdom to say, okay, yeah, that's fine. This is not threatening. And then the body decides to react. And in some cases that might lead to a release, because it could be some adhered tissue. And that might lead to the tissue being a little bit tender the next day. But I don't see anything wrong with calling that a release. Have you any comments to that, guys? Sharon or Jan?
Sharon?
Well, I wonder if from the odd shapes that you find when you go in and the different areas, it almost feels like when tissue is torn, any of the tissue is torn, it releases different kinds of fluids. And the fluids turn to like a stickier substance when they begin to dissipate, when the body clears out most of the histamine reaction and things go back to a more normal tissue. I think that this stuff is like a glue, because I almost feel like I'm separating out these little tiny bits and fibers.
Correct, right. Why not? Exactly. In other words, you get this coagulation, and sometimes it just needs a little gentle external force just to help it to overcome that little bit of an obstacle. And then the body says, oh, thanks for doing that for me. Now I can get on with these other jobs because I just couldn't quite get past that obstacle. That's quite a nice...
One of the things that we should mention is that we make sure that we try our very best not to give any pain to people. We work on the other side of pain, comfortable work. And most of it is very light and very nice, and it feels good. So
that's great, John. I'm just going to remind you that we do station ID in about 5 minutes. So the official part of the tea party is an hour. We go right to the hour. And if you want to bring any of our other authors in before that time, that would be awesome. And then after that time, we shift to a more mix and mingle type thing. And I think the conversation is likely to go on for beyond that. So John, I'll leave it to you to let us know how the team came together and what everybody was bringing to the book itself.
Okay, we'll do that real quick. What I would like to do as a shout out is that if there's anybody out there who has colleagues involved in research, then why not ask the question of saying, well, that's really interesting what Jan and Sharon and the others are saying. I wonder, could we do some kind of investigations? You know, could we do some observational studies and just see what we find? Because now is the time to do it. You know, with the production of this book, I think that can be the impetus that's needed. And just real quick, I think Joanne wanted to come in, and then we can certainly throw it to the other authors.
Well, I was actually going to bring Graham in at this point anyway, because what I was going to say was when I trained with Tom Myers, and I came back from, I remember my first work in 1998, and I came straight home and started studying craniosacral therapy because I wanted to feel the other end of the spectrum. And one of the things we talked about then was using our hands as magnets, and it was even behind soft touch. It was almost like not touching, almost encouraging the skin to participate, if that makes sense. And for me, bringing that into movement, where I think we have a very important role in movement. So I just want to shout out to that in adjustment, that movement adjustment can do what Sharon and John were just talking about just now, which is help that consistency, that texture of the tissue to very softly change if we listen in, if we get the pace right, and if we're very gentle. And what I was going to say was, I imagine that this is where Graham brings this into his practice, I've got no doubt, as an osteopath. And I know he wrote a beautiful chapter because I got to read them all. Graham, where are you?
Unmute yourself.
There.
Where is
we're like the Brady Bunch. Do you remember this?
Right. Yes. Well, having said that, Jan, I must confess that I never actually got involved in scar treatment. I know I've worked as a cranial osteopath, but I always shied away from that bit because it was a bit too, I thought, hands-on heavy And it wasn't how I worked, but now I've met these other people like Sharon and Jan, told me that things can be different, but that passed me by at the time. But the thing that really interested me was the biotensegrity perspective. And Jan asked me if I could make a model, a physical model to explain scars, which I found quite challenging, but the actual process of why scars formed, how they form, what it is, was fascinating to me just from the physiological, the biotensegrity perspective. And biotensegrity is essentially about the balance of invisible forces, tension and compression. And we can all see the effects of tension when we pull on our skin, and see tension there and the forces of distributing through the tissues underneath, and compression when we push our hands together. That's compression in a gross description. But these invisible forces are working all the time. So when we move, they're flowing through the soft tissues. And if you have surgery and the surgeon does whatever's necessary, then stitches up, following as a scar heals itself, then the forces underneath are going to be flowing differently because they're blocked by this fibrous tissue which forms in the development of the healing process. And as we move, those tensional forces are moving one way, then another way, but now they have to go a different way underneath, which may not be very much, but over time, fibroblasts in the extracellular matrix respond to those tensional forces and build more collagen along the lines of force. And as the more collagen develops, the tissue becomes stiffer, stronger, so more forces can be transmitted through it, which makes the fibroblast work even harder to produce more collagen, until you've got a really fibrotic tissue that then tracks its way through the body, because those tensional forces always operate in the most energy efficient way and always follow the path of least resistance. So my chapter is almost hypothetical, because when I was looking for explanations of how scars form and how they track through the body, I couldn't find anything that was really meaningful. So this is a way into hopefully other people to pick it up, and it's not particularly my idea, but it's something there to contribute to the whole.
I think everybody obviously Jan and Sharon, I think you can, and everybody can feel particularly proud, because I really believe this book is entering what are ultimately uncharted waters. It's fantastic. Thank goodness this book has come along at this particular time. And I think we could go into so many other questions, so many other areas. I touched on the idea, of the emotional aspect. And, I would have loved to have gotten into that in a little bit more detail. But Chris, I think we're kind of coming up on that time, are we? I want to make sure that
we're coming up to our station ID. So for those people who have to leave right on the hour, I'll just give a quick thanks, but I really love to also hear from Carol and also more from you, John, about how you're bringing the work together. But first, let me give a thanks to our special guest host, John Sharkey, and editors and authors. So Jan Trewartha from Windsor, UK, forgot that in the beginning, and Sharon Wheeler, who I've had the good fortune to meet. She came up from Seattle one day. We have also Graham Scarr and Leonid Blyum, Joanne Avison, and Carol Davis, who are all contributors to this book. Jan, would it be possible for you to put a link in the chat so that people can find out where to get the book? Because I'm sure that it's going to, lots of people are interested. They're going to want to get a hold of it. I know I believe it's available as an electronic copy right now and hard copy.
It is, I believe so, yes.
Awesome. We've just heard from Eugenia, who has just ordered it. John, I believe you've got something coming up on Monday. If you could put the link for that webinar, I know people would appreciate that. I want to then pass it on to Susan, I think, for the rest of the
Yeah.
station ID.
Yeah, I'm just going to do the sort of business end here. And boy, everyone, it's so wonderful to have you on. And what an amazing discussion about this wonderful new Handspring book. I'll say our Biotensegrity Party events are a production of the Stephen M. Levin Biotensegrity Archive in Washington, D.C., whose mission in part is educational. You can download our free BX 101 self-study guide to beginning biotensegrity, or join the email list and learn more at biotensegrityarchive.org. And once again, we want to give a huge thanks to our sponsor. We have several, and Handspring Publishing has been supporting us from the beginning, and we really appreciate that. This is a Handspring book, as is well, so many others, right? Wonderful books coming from them. If you join the Handspring mailing list, you get a discount coupon. If you join the Biotensegrity Archive mailing list, you get a discount code. So we want to thank Handspring for their generosity. Fernando Tejero and Artifact Pro in Madrid, Spain, thank you for sponsoring us as well and supplying a discount code to our participants that I think is good through the end of the month. So anyone on the archive mailing list already has it. And if you can't find it, let us know. And we want to thank Embodied Biotensegrity and Chris, and her outfit is giving us the technical support to bring this to you. And a special thank you to the ever flexible and supportive Mariana Barreto for lending us her tech skills, and the multi-talented archive newsletter editor, Rachel Tudor, for volunteering to help us as well. So if you want to join us on Zoom for any future events, or to get the coupon codes, as I say, get on that archive mailing list. I also suggest you get on the Handspring mailing list. And I'm going to say one more thing, and that is that I'm really happy to be able to tell you that Biotensegrity Party number 10 next Friday is going to be focused on orthodonture and dentistry. And we're going to have doctors Barry Raphael and Gavin James with us for that discussion. So they're applying biotensegrity understanding and principles in their work, and it's changed what they do. So something exciting to look forward to. Back over to you, Chris.
Okay, am I muted here? No, I'm not. Thank you so much, Susan. And let's now move on to the meet and greet. We'll finish up. I'm going to, by passing this back to John, because John's been doing such an amazing job bringing people out, having them share. He's so knowledgeable, and he's been gracious enough to come and host for us. So John, why don't you continue on the discussion? And in a little while, we will also get Mariana to start inviting people from the Zoom audience to also open up their cameras and join in the discussion.
And may I break in? I'm going to say thank you, Joanne. Joanne Avison has been monitoring the questions in the chat, and she's just been boom, 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 jumping right in with it. So thank you, Joanne, for jumping on board to do that. And thank you, everyone, for your great questions. If we've missed one, go ahead and ask again. But I want you to know that you guys are all free to just keep discussing things, because I think we're on top of most of the questions.
Great. Susan, would you be able to hop over to the YouTube live and pop in the title of the book and the Handspring website? Because I wasn't able to do that. I'm having complications.
Okay, we'll see if we can get that done. Great.
Thank you. Okay, go for it, John.
I have to say that I've never felt more proud in these COVID-19 times about being a member of the touch therapy and movement therapy community. I think everybody has just demonstrated that they are wonderful human beings. And I just want to say that I'm very, very proud of the way everybody has behaved themselves and have conducted themselves. And it's magnificent to be part of the Biotensegrity family. And we want to grow the Biotensegrity family. And we really invite people to get involved with us. One thing I have to say to you as well is that some of the conversations that arise out of the conversation of scar therapy might sometimes be a little bit uncomfortable. They're not always easy conversations. I do not have a religious bone in my body, but having said that, this takes us into the discussion of, for instance, male circumcision or female genital mutilation. And I think this book is just the beginning. There could probably be a second book and a third book from both Jan and Sharon, self-help techniques, because I mean, these type of interventions cause, we had somebody arrested in Ireland just the day before yesterday for a botched female genital mutilation. And it just absolutely breaks my heart and raises my blood. So, and that's scarring. And but these people could be helped if they could be given some guidelines in terms of how they might be able to heal those scars, or certainly change those scars. Okay, we'll put that in, that's just one of my soapbox stances. But yeah, I think it's back to, we were finishing with before Graham had spoken, we were talking a little bit more about resonance, as opposed to perhaps maybe the amount of when it's specific to the amount of force that's used. And Sharon spoke to this as well about gentle touch. I'd like to maybe expand that conversation just a little bit more, so that the people who are listening in, actually maybe we'd even go to Dr. Davies. Do you have a comment? Because I think there's such wisdom here in this group that perhaps Dr. Davies would like to talk a little bit about, the less is more approach to scar therapy. Now you need to unmute your microphone, or do we need to get somebody?
I can do it.
I can hear Graham. No, we can't hear you yet.
There we go. Thank you, Graham.
Yeah, great, Carl. You're with us now. Okay.
Thank you. And thank you, Jan and Sharon, and all the authors for a wonderful book. My contribution was very minor, and it was such a joy. Jan asked me to read the book and then write a foreword to it. And it's always a pleasure to be asked to write a foreword. Sometimes people ask me to do this, and I have a harder time resonating, and I use that word very cautiously, with the material in the book. But this book just really resonated with my soul. I started out in myofascial release actually as a physical therapist from my work in the 1970s and 80s in orthopedics, but there was always something missing. It was a very linear approach. It was a very, if the shoulder hurt, you worked on the shoulder. If the knee hurt, you worked on the knee. And you did soft tissue mobilization. And then I knew something was missing. And I took my first Barnes course, and I was invited to do this Barnes course by a colleague who said, I don't think he's a very good teacher, and I think it's a lot of malarkey. Will you go check this out? Well, when I checked it out, and I felt the cranial rhythm, particularly what we called the cranial rhythm, and then I realized that something was going on here energetically, and it was lining up with my research and thinking about how it is that I'm connected with my twin sister over long distances and immediately, and with dreams and with things that were happening in my life. All of a sudden things started to come together, and I said, there's something here that all of the biology and chemistry and physics that I ever studied doesn't answer. So I began to study quantum physics, and I began to recognize, it was very difficult for me, but I began to recognize that there was something about subtle energy in the tissue, the function of the fascia as a conductor of subatomic particles that linked up this immediate, this kind of connection and this resonance. And just very quickly, my sister and I were in a study when we were 20 years old, and we were at two ends of a hallway, and we were hooked up to a EEG, reading our brain waves. And there was a light bulb on a table. And when the command was, when the light bulb goes on, close your eyes for 20 seconds. And when you close your eyes, your EEG changes. And so the light bulb went on in my sister's room, and she closed her eyes and her EEG changed. The light bulb did not go on in my room. I was 50 yards away in another room. The light bulb did not go on in my room. I did not close my eyes, obviously, but my EEG changed. And when I saw that my EEG changed at the same time that my twin sisters did, and we were separated by at least 50 yards down a hallway, I started to envision, what is it that could connect us? And then I began reading more and more, and then I took Barnes, and Barnes always from the very beginning talked about connecting with that energetic link, listening to the tissue, not being linear. He understood fascia before the science came out, and he's one of those, what do you call it when you see under the skin, you can see it. Some people see the weeks as colors and numbers as colors. When Gimbartot came out with his movie, Barnes said, that's what I saw. I saw the tubules, I saw the polygons. And he started talking with Steve Levin very early on, and Steve contributed to John's first book, his linear kind of book of how to myofascial release. I kept reading and thinking, and I started practicing this, but you know, I was a physical therapist for 25 years before all this, and I still was very linear and very oriented toward trying to figure it out. And but I followed the principles of the pressure of the touch, go down to the patient and then feel and listen. And I wasn't feeling very much, but patients were getting better. And then John sent me material for a chapter in a book that I was writing about myofascial release, and he talked about unwinding. Well, I didn't want to get into that unwinding stuff. I mean, that's all, you know, ooh, I don't want to do that. But then I started to realize this is how thick I am and how trained I was in this linear approach. It's all unwinding. When Jans talks about feeling that tissue start to move, that's what Barnes talked about. And going down and waiting and sinking in 90 to 120 seconds. And then you sink down a little bit more, and then it starts to move. And somebody said, wait for this, feel it and wait for it. And you have to get out of your left brain and really feel it. And then what I sensed was the energy was coming in from around me, out through my hands into their tissue. Their tissue had its own electromagnetic wave. Mine had my own. And when it came into resonance, when the waveforms of their energy and my energy came into resonance with each other, then the tissue starts to unwind. And Barnes always says that's when the real release starts, and he calls it release. We didn't know how it was happening. Then in 2012, Pollack comes out with his crystallized water theory. Ingber had been publishing all along, but I didn't know to look there. On the architecture, it was moving me into Biotensegrity through the back door with Ingber. Then Levin invited John, and John said, you go. And I went to the first big conference in 2016, and it all started to come together. And that's that light touch and following the tissue. And in some sense, it's very much like yoga. It's being yoked to an energy system. It doesn't have to be religious at all. This is pure physics. Yoked to an energy system that's coming in through us and connecting in resonance with the tissue. The tissue is changing. The gel, the key is the gel. It's the polysaccharide gel starts to get thinner through thixotropy, and the piezoelectric effect moves those electrons through, and all of a sudden you start to feel things unwind. And even with scar tissue, that's what you feel. You feel that tissue start to unwind. And then the more you can direct people to that, and that was my talk yesterday or a couple of days ago on the interoceptors, directing people's idea, their feeling into the body so that they can feel the changes and then align with that feeling. And then that reinforces the change in the tissue. But I do believe, like Jan, you have to revisit that trauma that's in there in order to let it go completely. And people say, I don't want to remember that. It's not remembering. You're going, I said, don't shy away from that feeling. When the emotions come up, go down, dig in there, dive in there and get in there, and then allow it to let go. And then the relief comes, they can breathe, the pain is less very often. So that's a long answer to your story, but that's resonance. That's the energetic link. That's why I'm interested in the anatomy, because the anatomy shows us how, and biotensegrity and the compression, distraction, attention dynamic shows us how this is constantly responding to the energy of the field, the energy of other people, and the energy of the touch. And the more loving and compassionate the touch, the more your ego is out of the way, the more the complete release of that tissue. And then Joanne's concept of being able to move through, the fascia comes home to itself, the old code is broken up, and people are alive and in touch with themselves in a way that they weren't before.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, well, if somebody like Sharon was talking in the very earliest part of this presentation, and you know, we don't know all the answers. We don't know necessarily why we're getting results. We can verbalize it and talk about words like release, and there are others who will say, "Oh, that's ridiculous. You don't have the. Where's the science? Where's the evidence?" It's amazing how, if we didn't have people who had a hypothesis, and a hypothesis is based, by the way, upon years and years of experience. It's like the piano player who, I use this analogy all the time. You're learning to read the sheet music and you're hitting bum notes and you're making mistakes in the early days. And 20 years later, 25 years later, you walk into some nice piano bar and there's that pal you remember from being a kid. And he's or she's playing the piano and looking over at you and saying, they're not missing a note. Not missing a note. In fact, they could throw their foot up onto the piano and somehow they'd make it sound brilliant. You think, how are they doing it? And they're not even thinking about it, because now they've spent so many years perfecting this skill, which is a palpation skill, that they can just make it happen seamlessly. And I think that's what happens somewhat in bodywork therapy, that you take this journey, as Sharon has and as Jan has, and you reach a point where if somebody was to stop you and say, well, why did you go that way? Why did you ease off a little bit there? And you might have to stop and think, God, did I ease off? Did I go that way? Because you're listening to the body, you're relying on the feedback, and it's happening at levels that are subconscious. Why? Because that's where you are now in your career. You now have that ability to take in the information and react to it as a conversation between you and the body. I think, John, you're biting at the bit there, are you?
No, I'm just sitting here thinking I'm loving hearing you say this. It's great.
No, but it's what I believe. It's what I...
No, I know, it's lovely. We're all on the same page. It's great.
Yeah, I'm often trying to understand myself. I'm often trying to figure out why I do certain things. And that's really what I've come to, that it's very hard to verbalize and explain to people about a lifetime of experience. And yes, it's nice to be able to have the evidence, scientific evidence, but now what we need to do is, we need to be able to, I'll give you, just because of what Carl has said, our friend, Dr. Niall Galloway, who's not here this evening, is he?
He is here. Yeah, he is here, John.
Okay.
Oh, no, I'd love to hear Niall then. If you're here, Niall, please comment in terms of, you know, the lesser of two evils. When is a scar the lesser of two evils? And maybe a little bit about the mesh. And if you're willing, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but if you're willing, maybe you tell the story about the patient whose vitals dropped during an
It looks
operation.
like maybe he's not here at the moment. Can anybody scroll through?
I mean, he was there originally.
At the
I mean, he was
beginning,
there
but
in the
he
beginning.
might come after an hour. Yeah.
May have had to go off. You know, I hope Niall won't mind me sharing the story, but you know, Niall is a surgeon specializing in in prolapses, so pelvic anatomy in particular. And then Niall was in the surgery one day when suddenly the patient's vitals dropped, and he said to the anaesthetist, like, what are you doing up there that you don't normally do? And he said, I'm not doing anything. What are you doing down there that you don't normally do? And he said, I'm not doing anything. And so they basically stabilized this individual, made a note at the time and said, okay, let's move on. And the next day when Dr. Galloway was doing his rounds and came into this person and said, well, how are you getting on? This person said, yeah, no, I'm getting on okay, doctor. Just I'm a little bit down, a little bit sad. And he said, why? And he said, oh, well, my twin sister passed away yesterday. And Dr. Galloway said, he said, do you mind me asking, when did this happen? What time? And she said, oh, it happened around 2:15. And it was within a couple of minutes of her vitals dropping. And as I think Joanne knows what I'm going to say next when I say, you know, Dr. Galloway says, I'm not the guy. And I'm not the guy either, by the way. I've just been, you know, immersed in science. So I'm not the guy. I don't come into this easy. I really don't. But I want to try to encourage myself to have an open policy here. Because how do you explain that? You know, so it's just yes, Joanne.
All I wanted to say was that I find myself confronting what you've all been talking about a lot, but in a movement classroom, working with movement teachers, particularly yoga, but you know, I work with all kinds of movement modalities. And what I think can happen is that we start off at a sort of an intellectual level where we have to learn the features, and you can liken it to driving a car. The first time you get in a car, you've got an accelerator and a brake and a clutch, and then you've got a handbrake and a wheel, and you've got a mirror and a rear view mirror and side mirrors, and it's just so much information, and we have to somehow gather that at the intellectual level. And that's the level that for a lot of people, Biotensegrity may be at that level, scar tissue may be at that level, where they're learning the facts. And this is why I love this book so much, is because one of the things in this book is that intellectual research, scientific information that is quantifiable, thanks particularly to Leonid's chapter, where that quantifiable response that you want to other people is in there if you read it. But then we have the instinctive level, which is where you practice driving and you gradually get better and better at driving. And instead of thinking, oh my God, I've got a rear view mirror and a front mirror, and I'll never forget teaching my 17-year-old son to drive the first time. And he's like, Mum, why do I need 2 brakes and 4 mirrors and 5 levers? And why do I need my handbrake if I've got a foot brake? And which foot's doing what? And he had the wrong foot on the different, I can't even tell you. And I was like, just keep practicing on Dad's car, not mine, Dad's car. And what happens is we then enter this realm that I think all of us as manual therapists and movement teachers enter, which is the instinctive realm of crafting movement. And it becomes a craft. You just keep doing it. You just keep doing it. You just keep practicing. And then you discover things, and then you practice, and then you experience, and then you articulate that experience, and then you practice some more. And then suddenly something shifts, but it's very subtle. And that subtle shift is when you get in a car and you realize that you actually anticipate what's happening. You literally look out the front window and anticipate what's going to happen before it happens. You put your foot on the brake before. And I don't know how many times any of you have experienced this, but I know I have. When I knew that person was going to do that. I just knew it. And you enter this realm of comfort and presence where the mind stops chattering, because you know what you're doing, and you know what you're doing, but you don't assume you know what you're doing. But you get into this state of presence. And I think as movement teachers, that's where we live. And as manual therapists, once we're present with our client and we've done all that we need to do to make sure everything's clean and tidy and hygienic and we're then just present. And what's so beautiful about this book and the way Jan and Sharon have integrated the treatment aspect of it is that that presence is kind of widened and deepened. And from that place, we get something I call pre-sense. And what comes in is an intuitive sense. Now, I don't mean just because it feels good, it's right. I'm not talking about that. This isn't, believe it or not, it's not a hairy-fairy statement. It's what comes from practice, 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 all those years of experience you were all referring to. where that client walks in the room and you can spot an imperceptible limp. And you already know before they've sat down, there's an appendix scar. You just know there is, or there's a C-section. And it's not like you presume to know, you check it out because you're a good therapist, but you become like driving the car. You can actually listen to a language and learn it while you're driving and anticipating and checking your rear view mirror and watching what's going on and paying attention. And we develop this intellectual, instinctive, intuitive skill. And I think why this book is so exciting to be part of is that somehow it spans that whole web in a very appropriate way. And I know from talking with Jan, I mean, Jan, I'm gonna betray you a bit here with love and affection, but I remember practically in the middle of the night in Ghent at one of the big meetings, when you were standing there literally under the stars going, Jo, but I can't write this in a formal enough way and it's got to be intellectual. And I remember standing there saying, Jan, it's got to come from your experience as a therapist, or it won't land for people. They don't want to read a pile of research papers. They've got those. We've got to refer to those, but you've got to write from your heart, from your experience, as Sharon has, as in fact everybody in this book has. And I just think you've managed to find that balance. And as John says, I think it's going to invite everybody in. You know, I mean, that's the hallmark of this work. I mean, how many clinical anatomists are out there teaching clinical anatomy? I'm talking about the real deal. I'm talking about someone who teaches specialist brain surgery techniques to surgeons, who actually comes down to earth and makes somebody like me, who is not qualified in science technically, really get the value of how the cadaveric laboratory can reveal something to us that we can then take into our craft, our instinctively developed practice, be it movement or manual therapy or both, and then bring that intuition in and then language it. And there we have to say thank you to Handspring, because, you know, Handspring's motto is, Handspring was formed from Serena Wolfard's desire to know her authors. And I just think that's
I'm sorry, I'm going to break in and say, just speaking of, I'm having trouble for those people who are on YouTube. YouTube is stripping out all of the URLs that I've been trying to put in so that people can get to our sponsors and buy the book and all that stuff. So it is handspringpublishing.com. I'm just going to speak them out. Artefactpro.com, ARTEFACTPRO.com, and Biotensegrity.podia, PODIA.com. So, and then biotensegrityarchive.org. Thank you for the interruption.
Well, what I'd like to do is I would love to be able to offer the opportunity for people to put their hands up and to be able to ask the authors any particular question. But before we do, I just want to give a shout out to one of our really good friends, Kelly Clancy. Kelly has written there on the chat, learning how to hang out in the mystery past the level of the mind is the skill that can allow miracles to happen under your hands. And Kelly is a great individual, loved spending time with her. And I'm always amazed, you know, she pops up, you know, like so many of you, really, to be honest with you, like so many of you, pop up all over the place, investing your hard-earned money, you know, to follow the likes of me or others. And I'm hoping that the Biotensegral Tea Party is also a way of giving back to you. You know, it's a freebie and it's great. And this is just food for the brain, and particularly during the COVID, isn't it wonderful to be able to have this community to share? But are there, just because of the time, are there people here who would like to ask a specific question of Sharon or of Jan? I'd love to hear Sharon and Jan answer specific questions that you might have that would help you in making your decision. Should I buy this book? Because I think you should, obviously. But is there anybody who wants to ask the editors of the book any specific question?
They can put their hand up by clicking on, Mariana, maybe you can tell them how to do that. Clicking on the more section under the chat. Is that right?
I just wanted to maybe just one thing to say, because, we kind of deviated a little bit from biotensegrity. I must say that, it's been a brilliant sort of ode to experiences and to the wonders and elegances and of the therapies. But really, if I'm allowed to get some specifics, I wanted to say two things. So number one is that when we talk about Tensegrity, we talk about the specifics, right? Specifics of energy minimization principle in very, very tangible way that shouldn't be, you shouldn't be really a super connected individual or super kind of, like open the universe to get there, right? So it's really the energy minimization principle which guides the architecture both globally and regionally and locally, right? And on the practical side, if we continue to apply the biotensegrity principle even locally, what does it mean? So practically, it means the application of the metastability understanding, meaning that any element which is like too tense, too tight, too short, too whatever, has its reciprocal counterpair, right? So it means that there are elements which are going to be on the weakness side, on the excess, compliance, looseness, and so on. So in that sense, I really want to highlight all the time the practicality of biotensegrity, because as practitioners, everybody loves to follow the tense tissue. Everybody loves to follow all these convolutions of the tags and so on. But the invitation here would be that with these wonderful skills and touches, actually to look broader and to look at the weak elements as well, not only at the scar, but what could be the other element, like in the larger framework, which has been, affected by being out of the involvement, which has been shielded by the scar. And then obviously you think of your like principles of the same thing in the larger ways. So basically, if I'm speaking that way, I'm inviting, I don't have the flip chart behind two matrix, right? So you see, when you're looking here, this is short and tight. You should visualize that it's, according to biotensegrity principle, is surrounded by three other dots, right? So the opposites, the elements which would be completely loose and disconnected, right? So you see, and that would be those elements which would be like swollen, and then there would be elements which are over hyalinated. So, that's the practical application of the biotensegrity, to expand your map and to be able to see beyond just the concentrated restriction. So that would be kind of my point on the tensegrity applied in a practical way. And that's what I was trying to bring, like linking people to this peridynamics research and the metastability principles and how to unlock the, local minimums of the strain energy field.
So do we have questions from people who have been generous enough to give us their time and to join us? We'd love to hear from you if you...
I don't see any hands on, but I don't know if you, from the chat.
What I want to do is, the other way, the other thing I was thinking of in my mind as well was that if I was an author, there might be one or two questions that I would love the host to have asked me. So Sharon, is there something that I didn't ask you that perhaps you would have liked for me to ask you? And Jan, I maybe get you to think the same thing as well. Is there some part of the book in particular that's, one of your little gems you'd like to highlight? We don't want to give too much away, because obviously we would love people to buy the book, and it should be a great resource for them. But is there a question you would have liked? What's the answer to the question you would have liked me to ask?
Sharon?
Oh, I'm very happy with the discussion. It's
Right.
very interesting, all these different viewpoints. I think that's wonderful. And I can't think of something to say to that. I think we're doing just fine.
I think that reflects more about you, Sharon. I think that it's what I'm saying. And the same with Jan. I think you're a wonderful. My wife actually was reading about you and checking you up on the internet. And she came in the other morning. I was having breakfast and she said, I think Sharon Wheeler is somebody that we'd really love to meet and get to know better. I said, really? So she was impressed with you, Sharon. She thought you were great. Jan, anything you'd like to add to it, or while people perhaps are thinking about a question they may wish to ask her?
Does it have to be about Biotensegrity?
No, not at all. No, I mean in terms of...
It has to be, you know, we are in the Biotensegrity party.
No, this is...
We're all talking about Biotensegriity. It's the bloody foundation of everything we're saying. I might not be saying it in your language, but then nobody would understand me on the planet. So, with respect...
You know, at the end of the day, of course, it's around scars and adhesions. And all of the topics, of course, are related to Biotensegrity, but we don't have to keep on, you know, shining a light on the baby who's crying for attention. Let's talk about scars.
Okay. So yes, there is something I'd like to talk about, because probably one of my favorite part of the book is the third case study. I did 3 case studies, and the third case study, and she's happy, she wants to be known by her name, Bella, came to me supported by a parent, practically carried up the stairs and had to be helped to get undressed, to lie on the couch. And she had been bedbound for about 6 months. She had a history of being born with bowel atresia and having the dead part of the bowel removed. And then later in her life, she had lots of indications that weren't picked up, that possibly she had adhesions. And then as she got older, in her teens, it became very obvious. And then she had more surgery. She had revision of the scars. She had all sorts of surgeries. And it's a really fascinating case study. And when she lay down, and I asked if I could touch her tummy, because the scar is on the left lower quadrant of the abdomen. And I took a photograph before, and I asked if I could touch, and she was almost rigid. She'd never been touched in a way that wasn't medical on her tummy, you know? So she associated it with pain. And when we do that, what we do is we start with a stroke called featherlight sweeping. And it's literally a gentle brace so the skin doesn't move everywhere, and just literally working very slowly, lightly towards the scar. As Sharon says, go directly into the scar, into the vector pull. But when they're that tender and that raw, and she was raw, then you work further out. So I'm working further out. I'm working from the ribs down, I'm working from the hips in, I'm working from the sides in the most gentle way. And I probably did that for 35, 40 minutes, maybe, I can't remember, a long time. And then slowly she started to relax, and this look on her face of sheer relief and bliss, and saying, I've never been touched like that, you know. And it was almost, I hardly dared touch her because it was so raw. I don't think I've ever worked on anybody so raw. And as it came and the tissue started to respond, and her parent was watching, we were discussing it. And funnily enough, we were discussing Biotensegrity and all sorts of different things, because the parent had looked me up so and had done a bit of research before. So we were discussing what had happened. And slowly over did I do 10 or 12 treatments? I can't remember now, over these sessions. And we leave about 3 weeks between sessions, because the interesting thing is the body takes the scar work and what we've done and works with it and runs with it. So it's a waste of time and money doing another treatment next week or whatever. You don't need 2 treatments a week. You do one, maybe for 40, 50, 60 minutes maximum. And then the rest of the time you're integrating, helping that cascade of freed up tissue going through the body, so that you get a sort of global effect, just helping it and helping them stabilize and integrate. Because of course, as we've been saying, you know, with the alteration in the forces and then the compensation patterns, the body is very distorted and sometimes torqued inside 3-dimensionally. So you need to allow them time If I've got somebody for an hour and a half, I might work for maybe 40 minutes, and the rest of the time I'm just balancing them and integrating them and giving them a space where the emotions can surface at the same time. Because the emotions, you know, it's an inextricable link, as we know, between the body and the mind and the emotions. And when you're freeing up this kind of trauma, which has so much association of pain and injury and immobility and the fear, because as she says it in the case study, I knew my life would never be the same. You know, I was crippled and she was 28. And slowly over the months, that freedom started developing in her body. And on my before and after photographs, there's hardly any difference. To look at them, there's hardly any difference. But what happened underneath after these treatments? She drives her own car. Wow. She has her own flat. She's just been on a very, very long distance journey to the other side of the world for a research trip for her new business. And to be involved in something like that, and what a gift and what a joy. And you can hear the emotion in me. And when I introduced her to Sharon, well, I was in tears, you know, I was like in tears, because she just gave Sharon such heartfelt hugs and gratitude, because Sharon's work had given her life back. And I was honored to be just a vehicle, you know, I'm a little cog in her big wheel of her life. And that's Sharon's work that's done that. And it was, I don't think I've ever worked so lightly as I did with Bella, because the pain and the rawness was so bad. And to see somebody go, you can read it in the case study. I think it's one of the most powerful bits of the book. That, you know, everything, the whole thing is documented, and how she moved from being bedbound and crippled to being a relatively normal. She's still got problems, of course she has. You know, she needs more treatment, you know, but she, you know, she's functioning better. She's actually got more of a diet variety, because she was practically on liquid diet. And now she's living a relatively normal life. So I just want to share that with you, that, you know, maybe we can't document and scientifically explain every single bit of what is happening yet. We are raising money for research, and we will get it. Sorry,
that's an observational study, Jan. That's very, very powerful. And you know, for every action there's an opposite and equal reaction. So I think we are having that visceral experience as well. Listening to that story, we're having that emotional reaction too. I mean, that lifts your spirits to hear that.
Yes.
And if you can do that to
one
individual.
And we've got hands raised, I believe, first Summer, then Anastasia, then Yasmin. Go
Brilliant
ahead,
question.
But Chris, I'm going to jump in. For one thing, I couldn't figure out how to raise my hand. Maybe if I'm a host, I can't.
Yeah, if you're host, you can.
So I've been waving, but anyway, so I'm going to be rude and jump in, and then I'll sit back. And yeah, we probably have. I can hang out for another long amount of time. I don't know about the authors. I think this is more maybe for Graham and Leonid, but we know that thixotropic materials, this is a soft matter biology question. We know that thixotropic materials are thick, and then with pressure, they thin. And I wonder if there's a sort of new kind of thixotropy that we're seeing in the body, where a slight amount of pressure will help with that more fluidic transformation in the tissue. But then if you come in with too much, you're pushing it, and then it's getting hard again. So do you see what I mean? So like a bi-thickening, but then the little sweet spot in the middle where things could get fluidic. I don't know if there's something already in soft matter science about that. I don't remember seeing it. So I don't know if Leonid or Graham, or maybe there's somebody else who's up on soft matter.
No, I can't say anything specific.
But what was the question, in fact?
I'm sorry, I was first going to say, I just
Okay,
don't know what
so
the question was. Yeah, yeah.
The
So-
question was,
yeah, it's about thixotropic materials. So thixotropic paint, it's really thick, like ceiling paint. And then with the pressure of the brush, it thins out so that you can actually get it painting. So the pressure makes it thin. And what I'm wondering if what we're seeing in scars in terms of the biological soft matter is that a slight amount of pressure will help it make that transformation to a more fluidic state, a more released
well, but
state,
you see,
but
my
that
point is,
Hang on. So we're just
then make it hard again.
Forgive me interrupting you, Susan. Thixotropy is the name of a property, not a state. It's not about thickness. Thixotropy is a particular
Correct.
potential for response. And if you respond at high velocity, it will thicken and harden. And if you respond at slow velocity and different pressure, thins. It's a behavior. And so I think we have to be very careful that we're not talking about tissue density. We're talking about changing in fluid dynamics. So it's slightly different. We're talking about a property. And over to Leonid for speaking about that.
yeah, thank you, Joe, because really this is actually, it's a good conversation, right? Because there is so much research around, and there is so much over the intersections between different things that we do, different elements, because effectively, you know, it's like if we get back to the infamous topic of does biotensegrity include the liquid part? Does biotensegrity include the gels? Does biotensegrity include the fluids, and so on? So this is really where we have to get to the point, which partially was just already introduced by Joanne, where she highlights the fact that depending on the loads, right, depending on the total delivery of the loads, the same material, right, so you see it's going to behave differently. So when we talk about the bodies, right, so you see the only thing that we can actually control is the delivery, right? So we cannot control the response. And that's what I'm actually talking about, is that, well, I mean, I must confess that my original chapter ran into about 60 pages, right? And under beautiful, I mean, under guidance of Graham, who's been really super instrumental, and Joanne and Jen herself, right? So you see, I had to I managed to squeeze it into 20 pages, sort of, but made it into kind of telegraphic style, right? So, but if we look at the history, right, of body work in general, body work originally started from realignments, from forced action, like I'm going to take this and reposition it there. And to a certain extent, you can still have some, you know, traces of this in the conversations, or at least the messaging that the chiropractors bring to the people and so on. Realignment. I'm going to change it for you, right? So, and in that sense, this is what I mean when we talk about releases. That's what I'm trying to depart as well, that we completely remove ourselves from that forceful end, from that sort of type of the science which belongs to 100 years before. And what I wanted to use, and I think that that's going to be used a lot more in the forthcoming Three of a Kind by John, Joanne, and Jaap van der Waal, right? So is there conversation about morphological, right? So you see, it's one of the favorite expressions of Jaap. It's logical, it's morphological, right? But what we really have to see there is to understand there is no morpho without logical, right? And logical is the internal algorithms, internal controls that belong to the body. So the best that you can do is approach the limit, approach the interface with the body, and as peacefully, as, you know, accurately, as closely as possible. And the beauty of it is that the new sciences of the last 15 years, they give you the understanding how this super minimal interaction can possibly work. And you don't have to drag even the properties, because you have to speak within the things that you control. You control the mechanical properties of your approach. And behind it, the total aura of how you do it, because obviously if you are not approaching it in the empathic way, then you can get the excitability, and which is going to affect the mechanical properties, right? So you see, if the person is scared, as John said, fight or flight part. So you see, you really have to cool down and neutralize the fight or flight to the absolute possible minimum, and ideally to zero. So that's why I will keep pushing the same thing. I think that I have found a really beautiful point in the modern science of peridynamics, which talks about the metastable states. So metastable state is the one where you are really like because we ask the question, how come that these super capable self-healing mechanisms are not working? Why is not self-healing? And the answer to this is actually there, that it's possible for for the system to get stuck in the energies, in the state of this separation of the energy states. And there is even, the term for it. It's called Maxwell limit. So Maxwell limit is the energy minimization potential that the structure, that the tissue has locally, but it's being locked above it. So what you are doing, technically speaking, by approaching it as peacefully as you can, you effectively allowing it to cross the barrier and then reset at the lower, strain energy point. It's simple as that.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Leonid. I am going to jump in here on behalf of Summer, who's had her hand up for a long time, looking that we're approaching. No, don't be sorry. It's wonderful to hear from you, but we're approaching the hour, and Summer, Anastasia, and Yasmin have had their hand up, and I want to try and squeeze them in before we log off. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Chris. So the question is for Sharon or Jan. I'm just wondering if you found that there is a difference, or if there's any impact, the age of the patient, the age of the scar, or whether the patient has chronic medical conditions like diabetes, for example. Does that impact whether the scar truly heals or not?
Sharon?
It looks like the age of the scar doesn't seem to matter all that much. Probably is a good idea to intervene on the early side of it. But if people don't do that, then the scar sort of sets up and stays more or less, sometimes accumulating more, but usually it kind of stays that way for a lifetime. So it's good to get it done, some work soon, but it's not absolutely necessary, because I think that if you take a scar on that's been there for 50 years, that it will resolve pretty darn well. So to me, there's no urgency in working quickly on somebody that has a scar.
Okay. And chronic medical condition, would that, like people with diabetes?
I'm not the kind of person that deals with this. Probably a physical therapist would be able to give you a better idea. I mean, what I've noticed with diabetes is if you inject in different places, that tends to cause scarring. All the injection sites will leave a little bit of a scar. It tends to make the tissue a little less mobile, and you can return a lot of that mobility. I think you can do that for them. But I'm not an expert in all these different conditions. I take average people,
Thank you.
Thank you. Anastasia.
Okay. I really, it's more a dawning realization that no matter what we're doing as body workers, me as a Feldenkrais teacher, someone else as a structural integrator, I mean, it's a comment that the notion of the light touch is inviting to a biological organism, and that even a unicellular organism, anything is going to be attracted, I think, more to something that's inviting. If we think of it, so I'm just thrilled beyond belief to hear what Carol said, what Sharon and Jan have said about their clients. It's just, I mean, I happen to be trained in Feldenkrais, but I studied yoga, I studied different things, and the whole idea that we don't want to go in and push into a system is just, this is just so, I don't know, it's just been a wonderful thing. I wanted to just say thank you. I always had this idea that people were going in, working with scar tissue or fascial adhesions or these things in a very brutal way, actually, which would make you want to recoil. Yet in fact, you know, if we're working with this soft touch, I mean, what Leonard's saying about the resetting the lower strain point, I mean, these ideas of the system is perfect and that the system will rebalance itself. And you know, now I'm hearing, oh yeah, the scar will reintegrate in a way. The fascial layers will start to glide again. This is fantastic, phenomenal. So I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Okay, and Leonid, do you see you've got a question there in the chat? If you could answer that for Barry, that would be awesome. And we have one more person with their hand up, Yasmin.
Yasmin. So what do you want first?
Yasmin can ask her question. Oh, John, we can't hear you. Can you unmute John, please?
Okay, hold on.
Hang on, John. We can't hear you. There we go. Start again.
But there are apparently some questions on YouTube as well, but I can't see them anymore. Mariana can. I don't know how much.
Draw attention to some of the points that Jan made a little earlier on. And Jan, again, I'm just paraphrasing what you said, so please correct me if I put words in your mouth. But I think what it really is about, and this is so difficult, by the way. I think for a lot of the people that we're talking to here, I think a lot of you guys are mature and you're experienced. We're probably talking to a wider group. If you can get the word out about this particular conversation and presentation and about this book, that'd be fantastic, because it's about not trying to force your agenda, your preset idea. You know, I'm going to get you to release. It's not about that. It's about having you know, a conversation with the connective tissue, and try to avoid bringing your agenda to the table and listen to the body. And I think that's, you know, predominantly what has come out of this. And that is why if you go fast and furious and in depth and stick it, you're going to miss the conversation. You're not going to hear anything, in fact, because you're too busy being loud yourself. So you need to calm everything back down and just take a few moments to listen. I think, Chris, you wanted a question to be answered by Leonid, wasn't it?
Leonid was going to do that in the chat, I think, because we're trying to round up. And we've got Yasmin and Mariana.
Yes.
Says,
no,
Yasmin's had her hand up, and then Mariana, you could bring the YouTube questions, please, if you're willing. Yasmin, did
the
you
YouTube
ask
question
a
was from one person who's written 20 pages there, right? So
how come I can't see it?
See the motivation. I love seeing people being so motivated.
No, I mean, do you want me to read it? So it was a gentleman.
No, hold on.
Raphael in the chat, how did you describe that limit where the body fails to compensate? What did you call it? It's a 3-word answer, I think.
But Jasmine was first.
I don't mind either. Hi. Oh, I've really enjoyed this. It's one where if I hadn't actually looked at it today, and John reminded me, so I'm so glad I jumped on, because I have a fascination with healing keloid scars, because I mean I come from that family of keloids, and Joe answered it for me, so I am going to get the book. But the question goes a little deeper, because I wonder whether, if you're susceptible to keloid scars, and if there's an emotional or trauma in the body, or trauma in your life, I think you've answered that for me today. Does it go to other parts, and could it result in fibroids, for example? Fibroids in the heart, for example. So that was my question, either to Jan or Sharon. And can it be resolved with light touch?
Are you asking whether the trauma can be held in other parts of the body?
Yeah, and whether the scar can be, because the keloid scar is quite thick. And I just wonder whether that could be reintegrated into
Well, I would say probably Carol is the best one to answer, the one about the trauma, but I'd say yes, trauma can be held in any part of the body. And there are a lot of contributory factors as to where it sits. The keloid, well, a year ago, I might have said, oh, we have no techniques for keloid, but actually some of our students are, well, our Scarr work therapists are working out how to work with keloids. And starting to, certainly we seem to be able to thin it, spread it a little bit, just relax the tissue. And also, of course, it's not just, I know it's, of course, it's what it looks like on the top, but it is also important what's happening underneath, and the restrictions and the adhesions, and then the functionality that it's affecting. Okay, so there's that. In the book, I've got somebody who had there's a picture of somebody, she has a quite a broad keloid scar on the upper chest. And that started with, what did she have? She had a little pea-shaped sort of pimple thing. And they injected, sorry? Yeah, they injected, they injected cortisone into it, I think it was, that's right. And it got bigger and bigger and bigger, and now it's quite broad. And when we worked on it in the class, that was worked on very, very gently, coming in very much from around it, working in, as opposed to working on the scar itself. That what she experienced, and she writes about it in the book, what she experienced was a huge release of the emotions associated with this incredibly distressing thing that started off like a little pimple and became a mark across the upper chest, but also says that since then she has learned to accept it. She hasn't learned, she has just automatically started accepting the scar as part of herself, and the emotional part of it has gone. So I think we're going into very interesting territory, and we haven't learned everything we need to learn about it, but we are developing work with keloids. And yes, emotions, of course, can be trapped. Emotions can and will be trapped in any scarring, just as they can be trapped in any part of the body.
Thank you, Jan. Yeah, that answers my question.
Carol has something to offer more about the science of it. Are you there, Carol?
We're in the time though, guys, at the same time.
Thanks, John. Do you want to close up?
Yeah, I think, because we're now, we're at the top of the hour now. So
I'm going to put you on speaker view here.
Okay, so just thank you very much to our two editors and authors tonight, Jan Trewartha and to Sharon Wheeler. Thanks also to the contributing authors, and thanks to you guys who just tirelessly give us your support. It's great to have you, great to have your company. I hope you enjoyed this evening. I certainly did. So if you enjoyed it half as much as I did, then you enjoyed it twice as much as. Anyway, it was a great evening.
Thank you, all of you. Thank you, John. You did a lot of. John, you're going to be exhausted. You've done an amazing job here juggling everything. It's wonderful.
I get energy from this. I don't know about you guys, but I actually get energy from this. I get energized. I love it. I'm loving it. So let's just give a round of applause to everybody who contributed.
John, Dan, Graham,
amazing.
Joanne, thank you
together
so
someday.
much.
We'll be all together.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody. So lovely to see you.
Thank you. It's wonderful today. And we will be back again next week with Susan.
We're going to have Barry Raphael and Gavin James, who are, they work in the field of orthodonture and dentistry. And for them, biotensegrity, their understanding and knowledge of biotensegrity has changed their work. And from their perspective, is changing the whole field. So very exciting stuff.
Okay, great. Thanks. Any last words, Graham? I'm just going to end the YouTube live now.
Well, let's see your culinary cups and glasses and say cheers to the Biotensegral party.
Oops. Cheers, everybody.
Cheers, everyone.
The true English way,
Thanks for
right?
being here.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for your company.
Thank
Be
you.
safe. Isolate.
Thank you.